An introduction to positional breathing, and really an explanation of why we consider this an important piece of what we teach dancers, athletes, or really any client that comes to Present Tense Fitness for strength training. Breathing in general is obviously something we do all day, every day, thousands of times during the day and night. Usually it's a pretty passive thing that we do and we don't think a lot about it. But from a strength training perspective and a dance or movement perspective, obviously as we move more, we need to think a little bit more about our breath, and we need to be able to draw more air in to support higher levels of movement. So in general, when we think about breathing, we think about our lungs and our diaphragm, both of which sort of sit here in the central core part of our body. Our core is a really interesting part of our body because it is the connector between our lower body and our upper body. It's the place where all of the force is transferred during movement from those parts of our body. And so I think we all know and understand that having a strong core is something that's really central to good movement in our bodies. So from a strength training perspective, we talk about breathing a lot because it takes place in such a central part of our body, so it's important to understand. So what I want to do is talk about sort of three main points today. I want to talk about, number one, what does it actually mean to have a strong core? Because I think there's a lot of different definitions of that. So I'll talk about ours. Number two, what role in mobility does your core play? So in terms of being able to have both a mobile core itself and also being able to have very mobile legs and arms so that our limbs can move through a full range of motion. What does sort of mobility mean and how it relates to our core? And then number three is, what does breathing have to do with these two things? What does breathing have to do with a strong core and a mobile body? And how can we use breathing basically to aid in both of those things? So let's start with number one, which is, what is a strong core? In general, when you think about your core and strengthening your core, most people think about some of the typical abdominal muscles and making sure they're strong. They do things like crunches, planks, twists, all of the things that will strengthen these abdominal muscles in this core part of our body. And those are great. But what I want you to consider today is think about everything that runs from your hip all the way up to your shoulder. And think about all the other muscles outside of these abdominals that are in this part of your body, in this central location between your upper and lower limbs. We have a whole bunch of muscles in our back running up our spine. We have a whole bunch of muscles here between our shoulder blades in the back. We have a whole bunch of muscles here in our chest. And so all of those types of muscles are also actually central to having a strong core. So a key piece in strength training, a key concept is that in order to strengthen a muscle, you need to be able to fully extend that muscle and then fully contract that muscle. It needs to be able to move through a full range of motion in order to get stronger. And that's true of any muscle. So what I want to do is use the bicep as an example, because this is an easy one for most people to understand. And that is, if you think about our bicep, in order to make it stronger, we're going to want to be able to fully extend it, and then we're going to want to be able to fully contract it up here. If for some reason we didn't have a full range of motion here and we could only move maybe to here in extension, then when we went to try to strengthen it, we would only be moving through this range of motion, right? And that would not actually give us a good strong bicep. We need to be able to fully extend so that we can then fully contract the muscle. So moving from the bicep back to our core and all these muscles here between our shoulders and hips, if you think about all those different muscles, abdominals included, but also back muscles, muscles up here in the upper back between the shoulder blades, chest, what we want to be able to do is be able to fully lengthen those muscles so that we can fully contract them, so that we can have a full set of muscles in the middle part of our body that are strong. So to us, a strong core in a lot of ways means being able to lengthen in order to be able to contract a full range of motion of all of these muscles in all these different parts of our body, not just this front part of our abs, but our back and our shoulders and our chest also. So that is what is a strong core to start with, and what we want to think about as we talk about using breathing to help with this. Number two is mobility. So there's a couple different things to talk about in terms of mobility. The first is just the mobility of this part of your body, this core central part of your body. So if you think about it, it needs to be able to move through all different planes of motion. It needs to be able to twist to the sides. You need to be able to side bend. You need to be able to bend forward and backwards. Basically, we need to be able to have lots of range of motion through this part of our body. So mobility of this central part of our body, if you go to move into some of these twisting positions or some of these side bending positions, you'll probably feel it's requiring you to contract some muscles and extend other muscles. So just like what we just talked about with gaining strength, the mobility part of it is you need to have that full range of motion and be able to be strong enough to move in and out of those positions as needed for whatever type of movement that you want to do. So that's some of the mobility of our core. The second piece to it is the mobility of our limbs, so our legs and our arms, and having a full and pain-free range of motion in our arms and our legs. So let's talk about the legs first, because each of these has a little bit of different connection to our core part of our body. So our legs are connected to the core part of our body through our pelvis here, right? And our pelvis in general, similar to what we just talked about with our whole core, has a lot of motion to it. You can tilt your pelvis forward and backwards. You can kind of hike it side to side. You can do both of those at the same time. You can shift it to the left and right. So the pelvic bones in your body can be moved around in all sorts of different directions. And that is important because your legs connect through your hip socket to your pelvis. And so depending on the position of the bones of your pelvis, you can limit your range of motion in your legs or expand it depending on what position you put your pelvis in to allow your leg bone to have more access to a range of motion. And so the pelvis and the position of the pelvis can be very important in terms of the range of motion that we have at our hips for our legs to move. And this is important when we talk about core and all the muscles here in the central part of our body with breathing, because the pelvis position is controlled a lot by some of these muscles that are up here in this core part of our body. And so being able to control the position of your pelvis helps you gain a full and pain-free range of motion in your legs. Our shoulder blades and our shoulders are similar to the pelvis. So our arms are connected to the upper part of our body by our shoulder blades that sit sort of on our rib cage. And our shoulder blades, in order to have a full range of motion of our arms, need to be able to fully come together in the center and be pulled together like this. And they also need to be able to move up and around like this on our rib cage. And so in order to get my hand fully up over my head, my shoulder blade really needs to come up and kind of around my rib cage. So similar to the pelvis up on the top part of our body, the position of our rib cage can be very important in allowing motion of our shoulder blades. So a lot of people don't think about their rib cage being something that they control a position of, but we do have some control over that. So if you think about our rib cage, using my fingers here as ribs, we actually can use the muscles in the core part of our body to basically pull our ribs down and in, like an internal rotation of them. We can pull them together. We can actually shift our whole rib cage as a whole further back in our body so that it sits in a different position over our pelvis than it normally does. So we have some range of control of our rib cage, just like we do in terms of moving our pelvis around. And that becomes important if you're looking for pain-free range of motion in all sorts of ways with your shoulder. Your rib cage position is very similar to your pelvis. So from a mobility of our limbs perspective, having that range of motion can come from controlling the muscles here that control the position of our pelvis and rib cage. So that's why mobility can be affected by what we do with our core, the strength of our core, and our ability to control our core. So that leads us all back to number 3, which is breathing, and how breathing can help us with the first two, how it can help us with strength of our core and all of these muscles here in the central part of our body, and how it can help us with mobility. So the idea behind positional breathing and breathing in general is that when you do a big deep inhale, one of the things you're looking for is a complete and full expansion of your rib cage, and you're looking for expansion of your entire body between your shoulders and your hips in 360 degrees. So a lot of times when we take a breath in, our ribs here in the front and our belly sort of move out, but nothing else moves a lot. So what we're looking for in terms of full length of the muscles throughout our core is that when we take an inhale, that we are in a position such that we can actually lengthen all of these back muscles in the back. We can lengthen all of the muscles between our shoulder blades. We can sort of lengthen and extend all of these chest muscles to get a really full long extension like we would talk about with the bicep, so that when we go to exhale and get all the air out, the contraction of those muscles can then happen. So you can see how it's a similar thing to this sort of relax or extending and contracting my bicep muscle. I want to see that I can get all of this part of my body between my shoulders and my hips to fully expand when I inhale, and then give a nice strong contraction when I exhale. What this does is allows us to then strengthen all of the muscles in our core while pulling our pelvis and our rib cage oftentimes in and out of positions that will allow for a more full range of motion. So at its core, positional breathing, and why we find it to be an important part of what we teach all of our clients at Present Tense Fitness, is that it is a way to practice putting your body into a position that will allow you to fully extend all of the muscles that you may need in your core, so that you can gain strength in your core, and you can also gain mobility and range of motion in both your core and your upper and lower limbs.